Hello everyone, so today we're going to look at the corticospinal tract, and in particular we're going to cover two main things. Firstly, we're going to have a very brief overview of the two sub-tracts that make up the corticospinal tract, that being the lateral corticospinal tract and the anterior corticospinal tract. We're going to cover the main differences between the two. After this overview, we're going to look at how each of these tracts course, that is, how they get from the brain to the muscles that they innervate. Now, let's start off with an overview. The corticospinal tract is one of two so-called pyramidal tracts of the central nervous system. And these pyramidal tracts are mostly responsible for voluntary movements. This is opposed to the four extrapyramidal tracts of the central nervous system, which are instead mostly responsible for involuntary movements. We will not talk about the four extrapyramidal tracts in this video, nor will we talk about the other pyramidal tract, that being the corticobulbar, or otherwise known as the corticonuclear tract. We will solely focus on the corticospinal tract today. So, as I said before, the corticospinal tract is actually two tracts in itself. It is composed of the lateral tract and the anterior corticospinal tract. The lateral tract can be seen as the bigger one of the two because it comprises 80 to 90% of the total fiber content within the corticospinal tract. Whereas the anterior tract, sometimes also known as the ventral corticospinal tract, is the smaller one of the two because it only comprises the remaining 10 to 20% of the fibers within the corticospinal tract. Now, the lateral tract is responsible for fine motor movements, such as those of your fingers, of your toes. And opposite to this, the anterior tract, or the ventral tract, is mostly responsible for gross motor movements, so movements that have less precision but more power, such as those of your hip, of your trunk. And in order to give us these different types of movements, fine versus gross, the lateral and the anterior tract must innervate different muscle populations. So for example, let's look at the lateral tract. We want fine motor movement of, let's say, the fingers. So as a result, I want to innervate muscles of my forearms, muscles within my hands, all those muscles that give me movement on my fingers. And these are what we call distal limb muscles. Whereas with my anterior tract, because I want more gross motor movement, I will focus more on the proximal limb muscles, such as those of my shoulder, as well as muscles of the trunk. And we can represent this on a diagram here. The lateral tract will be covering all of these regions here. So the distal limb muscles to give us fine motor movement. I'm coloring the anterior aspect right now. And the same thing will be for the posterior aspect, all of the posterior distal limb muscles as well. And conversely, on my anterior tract, I want muscles of the proximal limb, such as that of the shoulder, and also muscles of my trunk. This includes muscles of the back, so the posterior trunk, which is just the back. And if we look at these two diagrams together, we'll notice that this basically covers the entire body, except for the head and the neck. However, we still have voluntary movement of the head and the neck. For example, I'm able to talk to you right now. So what tract covers the head and the neck? Voluntary movements of the head and the neck. That would be our corticobulbar tract, our corticonuclear tract. And again, we will not go into that today. Now, one other very key important difference that I want to cover before we move on to looking at how these tracts course is that the lateral tract gives us what we call contralateral innervation. Whereas the anterior tract gives us what we call bilateral innervation. Now, what do we mean by this? So remember that the lateral and the anterior tracts are both paired structures. You have one on your left side and you have one on your right side. With the lateral corticospinal tract, what happens is that the left lateral tract will go on to innervate the right half of your body, whereas the right lateral tract will go on to innervate the left half of your body. So the opposite. And that's why we call it the contralateral innervation. Contra meaning opposite. Conversely, with my anterior tract, I still have one on the left and one on the right, but what happens instead is that my left anterior tract will go on to innervate both the left side and the right side of the body. And my right tract will do the same thing. It will go on to innervate both the left side and the right side of the body. And that's what we call bilateral innervation. And I want you to keep an eye out for how this contralateral and bilateral innervation arises when we look at the course of these two tracts now. Okay, now let's look at the course of each of these tracts. Now, I know there is a lot of information on this screen. Don't worry, and do not try to digest all of this at once. Just follow my explanation. I'll step you through it one step at a time, and it will make it a lot simpler, I promise you. So, let's start off with the lateral tract first. So, what I've done here is I've taken a coronal section of the brain at the level of the precentral gyrus, which is the location of the primary motor cortex. And I've laid out that as a 2D coronal representation over here. So you can see this cortex here is all of your primary motor cortex, your motor strip. Now, within our primary motor cortex, there is actually a very specific representation or arrangement of our motor neurons. Specifically, all of these medial regions of the motor cortex here is going to contain the neurons that go on to innervate my lower limb. So things like my feet, my leg, and my thigh. As I move more superiorly up to this region here, I start to see motor neurons that go on to innervate my hip and my trunk. As I then move more laterally here, I will start to see motor neurons that go on to innervate my upper limb. So things like my arm, my forearm, and my hand. Now, as I move even more laterally and somewhat even inferiorly, I will start to see motor neurons that go on to innervate the head and the neck region. So things like my nose region, my lips, and so on. Now, all of this region down here, the head and the neck, remember, that is our corticobulbar tract, which we will not worry about today. Whereas everything above this yellow line here, so not the neck and the face, all of this stuff here is going to be concerning our corticospinal tract. Because remember, our corticospinal tract covered all of those regions of our body except the head and the neck. So let's remember back to what the lateral corticospinal tract actually does. It gives us distal limb muscle innervation for fine motor movement. So where are we going to find the upper motor neurons of our lateral corticospinal tract? Well, we're going to find it in the regions of the motor strip or the primary motor cortex that represent those fine motor movement regions. An example that we're just going to work with here is the hand. Obviously, I have fine motor movement of the hand. So we're going to have a upper motor neuron cell body here in this lateral region representing the hand. It's going to send its axon down towards the brainstem through this region, this white matter tract region between the thalamus and between the putamen and the globus pallidus. This white matter region here is what we call the internal capsule. And we're just going to take a moment here to look at what specific part of the internal capsule the lateral corticospinal tract actually travels through, because there is a very specific arrangement that we also have to appreciate. So if we look over here, we have this boomerang looking structure. This is the shape of the internal capsule if you were to take a horizontal or transverse section through the brain. So a section like this. And you cannot appreciate this shape in a coronal section here, which is why I've drawn it here. So when you take a transverse section through the internal capsule, you'll see that this boomerang shape has three main regions. The internal capsule has an anterior limb, a genu, and a posterior limb. The anterior and posterior limbs are named as such because they are just the anterior facing portions and the posterior facing portions of the internal capsule. Now, the genu is named because genu means knee. And you can see that this sort of looks like a lower limb. It looks like this is the thigh and this is the leg, and this will be the knee. And that's why we call it the genu. Now, within my genu and posterior limb, there is also a very specific arrangement of fibers, just like my motor cortex. Specifically, the genu is going to contain fibers that go on to innervate the head and the neck. Again, what is that? That is the corticobulbar tract. So we will not worry about the genu today. My posterior limb, on the other hand, is going to contain three main segments. A segment for the upper limb, a segment for the trunk, and a segment for the lower limb. So upper limb, trunk, and lower limb. Now, because my motor neuron that I've chosen for this example is going to innervate the hand region, I'm going to travel through this upper limb region of the posterior limb of the internal capsule. But I can't just travel through any part of this upper limb segment because, as it turns out, the internal capsule is actually split into two halves down the middle here. The medial half, all of this region here, is going to contain sensory fibers, whereas the lateral half here, all of the stuff shaded in blue, the lateral half, that's going to contain my motor fibers. And lateral and the anterior corticospinal tracts are to do with motor. So therefore, I'm going to travel through specifically this region here for my example today. Now, as I travel through the internal capsule and continue onto the brainstem, I'm going to travel through the three parts of the brainstem: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. Now, remember that when we take a transverse section through each of these components of the brainstem, we can separate the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata into three main regions. The most posterior region of the brainstem is known as the tectum, and that's shaded in orange here. The middle part is known as the tegmentum in green, and the most ventral or anterior part is the base, shaded in blue. Now, with regards to today, you can forget about tectum, you can forget about tegmentum, because the corticospinal tracts, they only travel through the base of the midbrain, the base of the pons, and the base of the medulla oblongata. Base, base, base. Very easy to remember. So let's look at the base of my midbrain. The base of my midbrain is also known as the crus cerebri, or the cerebral peduncles. And just like my internal capsule, and just like my primary motor cortex, there is a motor representation. There is a very specific arrangement of my motor neurons. Specifically, I can divide the cerebral peduncles, or the crus cerebri, or the base, whatever you want to call it, I can divide it into three segments. I can divide it into a lateral segment, a middle segment, and a medial segment. The lateral segment is going to contain fibers that represent my trunk and my lower limb. The middle segment is going to represent my upper limb, and the medial segment is going to represent my head and my neck. And what tract is that? That is going to be my corticobulbar tract, so we will not worry about that today. Now, as I go onto my midbrain, because I've chosen the example of my hand, I'm going to go through the upper limb region, the middle segment. I'm going to travel down to my pons, and I'm going to go through the base of my pons, and I'm going to travel towards the base of my medulla oblongata. Now, the base of the medulla oblongata, just like the midbrain, has a very specific name, and it is known as the pyramids of the medulla oblongata. At the pyramids of the medulla oblongata, a very, very important event occurs. We call it pyramidal decussation. Pyramidal decussation. All that means is that it crosses over to the other side. My axon crosses over to the other side. And do you see how the contralateral innervation now arises? Once I cross over to the other side, I continue descending down the spinal cord on this contralateral side through a white matter tract known as the lateral funiculus. And through the lateral funiculus, I will descend down to an appropriate spinal level, whereupon the axon will go into the ventral horn of the spinal cord and synapse with my lower motor neuron. My lower motor neuron will then send its axon through the ventral root of the spinal cord, through the spinal nerve, and once I've passed the spinal nerve, I reach a junction. I can either go through the dorsal ramus of the spinal nerve or the ventral ramus of the spinal nerve. Now, the ventral ramus is going to contain fibers that represent my limbs, my anterior and lateral trunk, whereas my dorsal ramus is only going to represent the back. And because we're looking at the hand for this example, the hand is part of the upper limb, so therefore I'm going to go through the ventral ramus. I'm going to go through the ventral ramus, and I'm going to go and innervate my muscle. I've just chosen a example muscle here as the flexor digitorum superficialis, which is one of the muscles of the forearm that help give fine motor movement to your fingers, but it can be any muscle in the hand or the forearm that gives you innervation of the fingers. So that is the course of the lateral tract. Make sure you remember pyramidal decussation because that is the point at which the contralateral innervation arises. Okay, now let's have a look at my anterior corticospinal tract. And now that we've done the lateral tract, you're going to see that the anterior tract shares a lot of similarities, but there are a lot of key differences along the way. And I've highlighted these key differences with these blue asterisks that you can see here. So, like I've done with my lateral tract, I've taken a coronal section at the level of the precentral gyrus or the primary motor cortex, and again 2D representation here. Now remember, for my anterior tract, what do I want? I want gross motor movement. I want proximal limb muscles or muscles of the trunk. So here I'm just going to choose an example and I'm going to draw my upper motor neuron in the region that represents the back. The back is just the posterior trunk. So I've drawn my little motor neuron here. My upper motor neuron is going to send an axon, again, towards the brainstem through the internal capsule. Now, we've learned the structure of the internal capsule. So have a think about what region of the internal capsule this axon is going to travel through. Okay, it's going to travel through this region here that represents the trunk. As it goes down, it's going to reach my midbrain. And at my midbrain, again, I have three segments, the lateral, the middle, and the medial. Where am I going to travel through? I'm going to travel through the region that represents the trunk. That is the lateral segment, okay? And then I'm going to go down and I'm going to travel through the base of the pons. Again, base, because it's corticospinal. And then I'm going to reach the medulla, the base of the medulla, the pyramids. Now, this is the most important difference between the anterior and the lateral tract. The anterior tract does not decussate at the medulla. It instead continues down on the same side, the so-called ipsilateral side, and travels down the spinal cord, not via the lateral funiculus, but rather via another white matter tract known as the anterior funiculus. Pretty easy to remember. Lateral funiculus for lateral tract, anterior funiculus for anterior tract. Now, at an appropriate spinal level, what's going to happen is that it's going to decussate at the spinal level. So it's going to decussate in the spinal cord rather than in the pyramids of the medulla, unlike my lateral tract. It's going to decussate and it's going to go into the contralateral ventral horn of the spinal cord. Now you might be wondering, okay, if it decussates, shouldn't that also give rise to contralateral innervation, just like my lateral tract? How does the bilateral innervation of the anterior tract arise? Well, you have to remember that these tracts are not just one single axon. They are a bundle of axons. There are many axons. So what's going to happen is that only a certain proportion of this tract is going to decussate. Some are going to not decussate and going to instead remain on the same side and synapse with the lower motor neuron on the same side. And that's how we get the bilateral innervation. In the case today, we're just going to talk about the contralateral case, but the ipsilateral case will follow the same course. So with my contralateral case, the lower motor neuron is going to send an axon through the ventral root. It's going to go into the spinal nerve, and here I've hit a junction again. I can either go to the dorsal ramus or the ventral ramus. Where did we pick our upper motor neuron example to be? We picked it to be in the back, the posterior trunk. So therefore, I'm going to go through the back, the dorsal ramus. And I'm going to innervate a muscle of the back. In this case, I've just chosen the erector spinae group. So please remember, there is bilateral innervation versus contralateral innervation, and remember how these differences arise in terms of the course.